Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we give you a very warm welcome to the panel Strategic Planning for Emerging Markets, for which we have the special participation of Dra. Veselina Stoyanova, who is currently an associate professor in strategy and international business at the University of Birmingham Business School. Her research explores strategy development and change during turbulent events and contexts, with a focus on resource management, orchestration, accumulation, mobilization, and investment, and capability development. Recently, she is involved with a project that explored the implication of turbulent events such as the global health crisis for migrant entrepreneurship. The context is the study of the knowledge-intensive sector, which currently comprises 2.5 million businesses in the UK. The research aim of this study to explore how migrant small businesses and entrepreneurs navigate, shape, and adapt their business leverage strategy in time of crisis to minimize the impact of economic crisis, as an unexpected event which poses a significant business survival threat. Recently, she was included in the prestigious Post and Quant 40 Under 40 Best MBA Professors in the World for 2001. Her research work has been published in various books and journals, including Journal for Management, International Smart Business, Journal Technological Forecasting, and Social Change, among others. We leave you with Dra. Veselina Stoyanova. Welcome, Dra. Stoyanova.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Antonio, for the wonderful and very detailed introduction. I hope everyone is enjoying the morning. Greetings from the UK. Here is already afternoon, so it's much chillier than in nice and beautiful Colombia. I hope everyone has been enjoying the nice events and presentation. Today I'm going to talk a little bit, just an overview basically of strategic planning for emerging markets, where we are heading and why we need to think about the rise of emerging market multinationals. And we'll see that actually a number of great companies and emerging market multinationals nowadays are coming from your side of the world. So as students, as future practitioners, you need to think in terms of that direction, because this might be a future workplace for you, or you might be already working for a number of emerging market multinationals from Latin America. So if we just discuss the agenda, a few things on the next slide that I'm going to talk about. Well, first, some of you might have heard the term emerging markets, multinational enterprises, but for those of you who might still wonder what are those terms, I would provide a bit of a kind of conceptual overview. Then we're going to look at what are the main differences between emerging and developed economies, focusing on some of the global operating models of emerging market multinationals and also developed multinational enterprises. Is there a shift of global economy for which we need to start planning strategically? We will see that there is a significant shift. At least that's what the statistics, global statistics are telling us. And we're going to look at country-specific advantages as well firm-specific advantages, and which one of these country-specific or firm-specific advantages emerging multinational enterprises have, or both. And then we'll talk a little bit about strategies, and we'll finish with some questions. Okay, so if we look at just briefly some of the definitions of actually what is a multinational enterprise, some of you might argue that, well, COVID has slowed down some of these trends, and we can see more deglobalization globally rather than globalization. But still, if we look at where most of the economic there's still a shift in economic global economy, and we'll see that there is still a huge contribution and in terms of the role of multinational enterprises. So there are various definitions of multinational enterprises. There is the kind of operating definition, exploring the fact that looking at multinational enterprises as having activities in multiple countries. There is a structural definition. This is if you go and do kind of an overview of the various definitions and you read various research outputs. The structural definitions stresses on the fact that there is organizational design, or the structure of the organization needs to be internationally oriented if we are to define them as multinational enterprises. Also, there is a performance criterion, and the performance criterion means that you have to have a number of subsidiaries outside your home country, or a percentage of your profit should be outside of your home country. Meaning that if it's a Colombian multinational enterprises, that you need to have a couple of subsidiaries in other countries, let's say in Europe, in China, or elsewhere. And we'll see what are some of these trends and differences. Behavioral criteria as well, where we look at differences in terms of organizational culture, also key locations, what are the key people, and also we have if we look at specifically emerging markets, multinational enterprises, in terms of definitions and conceptual knowledge, there are two main components. The first one is that they have to come from an emerging market, and we will see what is an emerging market. And the second one is that it has to hold assets and also employees, skilled labor located outside the home country. And if we go to the next slide, which shows Bartlett and colleagues' integration responsiveness framework, we will see that they are, when you're internationalizing as a company, any company that has decided to go abroad for various reasons, whether these are resource-seeking motifs, whether these are growth-seeking motifs, they has to respond to various pressures. Pressure for local responsiveness, meaning that to what extent the company you want to adapt your product to the local culture, for example, or certain aspects of the marketing mix, meaning your product, your promotion or communication strategy, or your distribution channel, your price strategy. And also on the left side, you have pressures for going for global integrations, meaning that the pressures for achieving economies of scale, cutting the cost, basically, simply said. So you have four main, according to Bartlett, this is from International Business Theory. Some of you might be familiar with these works, for others it's quite new, I guess. So you have four different type of strategies through which you can internationalize. If we look at international marketing, for example, the first one is when you kind of replicate what is at the home country, so home replication strategy. And the other one, what works, for example, in Colombia, you believe it will work in some other Latin American country. And you'd likely to expand to another foreign market and start to strategically plan expansion through, for example, exporting as a market entry strategy. You have the global strategy, which is more likely in kind of more global industries. And also you have a multi-domestic strategy where that's more likely in multi-domestic industries. For the multi-domestic strategy, also we can say that you have much more pressure for local responsiveness. So the level of adaptation or customization in the foreign market, which will be higher due to, for example, more cultural differences. And transnational strategy, it's more likely in global industries. And here, if we think of transnational strategy, it's also called regional strategy. And it's kind of getting the best from both global strategy and multi-domestic strategy, if we can say that. And trying to achieve both, let's say, economies of scale, try to cut the cost, but in the same time would customize and respond local pressures. And why we are actually saying about this integration responsiveness frameworks and what it has to do with strategic planning, whether you are a small, medium-sized company or whether you are an emerging market multinational company, we know that still resources are quite scarce. There is a scarcity of resources, not unlimited resources. You might say, yeah, but larger companies have much more resources, of course, but they also need to respond to more risks, to take more risks, to respond to more stakeholder pressures, and that involves allocating resources, and which means that they need to be quite careful where they focus their attention and also where they allocate those resources. So if we look at the emerging markets, as I start next slide, please, that I start already to kind of define or give you some hints. If we look at emerging markets and what are those emerging markets, these are nations with social or business activity in the process of rapid growth and industrialization. Currently, we can say that there are between 21, 28 emerging markets in the world, which, for example, China, Russia, India, Brazil, being some of the largest and the leading ones. And we can say that there is the largest actually regional emerging market in the world is the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area, which was launched in January 1st, 2010. And we'll see that in the kind of the trend, if you compare those markets, you'll see that in the 1980s, many of those emerging markets, this 28 emerging markets currently, they were quite less economically developed countries, like quite developing or underdeveloped, some of those. But they, through various, for example, political opening of the markets due to more liberalization of the markets, we can see that some of those economies have grown significantly. And if we go on the next slide, you see that if you check the Dow Jones list, it will show you that there are 23 countries. At least 10 years ago now, it has grown significantly. You have South Africa, Taiwan, Thailand, UAE, Colombia as one of the emerging markets. So if you are working or if you are currently looking for an employer in Colombia, you would probably, many of you would think of working one of these emerging market multinationals that we mention. But Colombia, Brazil, Chile, from kind of the more Latin American, Peru as well, Latin American context, they are all classified under the emerging market umbrella, according to Dow Jones list. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that there's the FTSE group as well, which kind of differentiates and classify two different the emerging markets under two different kind of groups. The first one is the advanced emerging markets, where you have upper or lower middle gross national income countries, and it compares them with advanced market infrastructure or high gross national income countries with lesser developed market infrastructure. These are Brazil, Czech Republic, some of those, Mexico, Malaysia, Poland, Taiwan, Turkey. And you have also second emerging markets, which are kind of there is some low, some medium, upper medium, high gross national income countries with reasonable market infrastructure if you compare the infrastructure. And also there is a significant size and some also upper middle gross national income countries with lesser developed market infrastructure. And if we see what actually all these nice graphs and statistics from the Dow Jones and all these definitions tell us on emerging markets, we need to, in order to tell the kind of the story or where things are leading, we need to compare them with developed economies or developed countries. So what are the differences between some of the main differences between emerging countries and also developing countries? First, of course, what these indexes here show is that we see in emerging countries, if you compare in terms of wealth, it's much lower, the gross domestic product per capita in emerging countries than in developed countries. Growth rate is the opposite. Growth rate has is quite rapid. Usually it's like 6% per year. Well, this is pre-COVID statistics. Now, as you are all reading various news outlets and the media, you see that there has been quite a decrease in this growth rate, but still, for example, China and some of those other, China mainly, has still managed to kind of keep up with the growth rate and to come back quite fast. Growth volatility is also quite high, so markets are promising, but also if you are to internationalize in emerging economies, you are taking a more significant risk because of fluctuation in currencies, for example, or generally in the markets. Growth volatility in developed countries is low, and markets are quite mature. So you don't have that many, surprises unless there is another financial crisis or health crisis, hits these markets. Institutions, when you look at politics, government, institutions in general, in emerging markets are quite weak, both in terms of legally, intellectual property right, for example, might not be that protected. Or at all, labor market institutions. So emerging economies have significantly weaker institutions than institutions in developed countries, which are known to be quite strong, established, and also consumers. So if we are to compare consumers in these two contexts, you see that consumers are quite segmented and very much differentiated, where you have much rising middle class and much poor class. Consumers are predominantly middle class in developed countries, and you don't have that much of you have some segments, but you don't have that much of a differences between different classes. And if we go to the next slide, you see on this slide some of those trends that I just discussed in terms of what is different between developed versus emerging economies. And you see, if you compare over the years, every 10 years basically, what has been happening in terms of population growth, GDP, merchandise exports, inward FDI, and outward foreign direct investment, you see that the trends are, you see significant increase of GDP, while in advanced economies you see significant decrease of GDP. Population has, in emerging economies, has grown. Now it has kind of this growth has slowed down a little bit, but still, if you compare with advanced economies, it's kind of much high growth in terms of population and also inward FDI. So in terms of FDI, actually, you see that inward FDI has been growing, although it's still less than developed advanced economies. You see that it's much more growing right now, and outward FDI, it's higher in advanced economies, but if you compare the growth rate, you see that outward FDI in terms of growth rate is much higher in emerging economies. So we see much more kind of outward, inward FDI and transactions happening in emerging economies. And the next slide is quite an interesting slide. Actually, it's the other slide. So this is the slide that I just explained, that you can see the different trends in terms of rising emerging economies. And if you go on the next slide, Anthony, I think we need to move to the next slide. Yeah. So these were some of the So in many emerging, what it's shown here is that in many emerging markets, the value of all the kind of freely traded shares of a firm that is featured in the local MSCI index, which typically presents 85% of all the companies, is equivalent really of the shares of a single Western firm. So here you see that, for example, Egypt is if you look at all the shares in Egypt which are freely traded, there are as many as these of Burger King. Or you see that Nestle has more shares than as a company than, for example, India as a whole. So you can see that emerging markets, if we go to the next slide, you see that emerging markets here, they are still, in terms of shares, in terms of market capitalization, they are much less than, for example, single Western companies. And on the next slide, we can see, if we compare some of the sources and also the destinations of foreign direct investment. So if we, on the left side, you have the source of foreign direct investment. And on the, actually it's the previous slide, but it's okay. If you see, if you go on slide 11 on the graph, you see that there is a source of FDI. It can go either from a developed country to another developed country, or from a developed country to a developing country, which usually has it happen, especially if the multinational companies are planning to internationalize, mainly because of resource seeking or growth opportunities that they have identified in the foreign market, especially in contexts where industry in the home country, in the Western home country, it's in the kind of in the mature industry, and they seek an opportunity. They see that there is a specific industry for their firm is in the growth industry abroad. So that's a motivation to internationalize. Another one is if you are, we look at one of the trends which is happening, and there is a lot of research now. People are interested in when emerging market multinationals, they go and they internationalize in another developing countries, mostly kind of down market FDI, it's what we call it. But the most interesting and where there is a lack of research is CEL4, which is basically shows kind of the trends from developing country to a developed country. So although we have been seeing emerging market multinationals going abroad in other developing countries, for example, Chinese multinational companies internationalizing in Africa, kind of the trend of now what is happening is we see developing countries multinationals going, or emerging markets multinational going to developed countries. Yeah. And this is quite an interesting case, theoretically, because it goes against the conventional direction of capital, technology, and also knowledge flows. So it's a great example of how existing, for example, international business theories fails to explain, because they are mainly focusing on developing theory based on observation in developed countries context. And just to demonstrate these trends, we can see that, for example, Lenovo acquisition of IBM personal computers is an example of this developing countries multinational going to developed countries multinational. Tata Steel, for example, takeover of Anglo-Dutch Coral Steel. Also the acquisition that Tata had for Jaguar Land Rover. And Mittal Steel, for example, from India, merger with Arcelor, France. So we have a number of examples, company examples, which are showing the trends that in this CEL4, or developing countries multinational going to developed countries Okay, so if we just move on the next slide. Is there a shifting balance of power in the global economy? There is a shifting balance of power in the global economy. And on this slide, you can see that there are various companies from emerging markets. So you have Embraer, for example, in Brazil, which has grown significantly. I recently traveled with them to Finland. Gazprom, you have Huawei, Lenovo, Arcor, Cemex. All of these companies, Tata, of course, which has grown so much. So it now has Tata consultancy services, Tata Motors, even a Tata town, surprisingly, one of my students from India told me recently. So we have great examples of emerging market multinationals. And if we look at on the next slide, some of the global leaders, you see that a number of those global leaders actually are coming particularly from Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, from Latin America. So, for example, Arcor being number one in candy in terms of global position, Mexico, Bimbo, of course, being number one in terms of bread, bakery production. So great examples of Latin American emerging markets, multinationals. And if we go to next and try to think from business terms or strategically, if you have, let's say you're a manager, some of you have this, of course, intentions. If you think about the operating model, so in terms of the differences between emerging multinational enterprises and developed multinational enterprises, there is quite a lot on this slide, but what I would like to stress out is few main points. Is that research shows basically that developed multinational enterprises, if you compare their operating models, the different components, the structure, for example, the different communication processes, other organizational processes, technology, and also performance management metrics, that's what they would emphasize. So the main emphasis of the operating model of a developed multinational enterprise would be on the organizational structure, on the processes, of course, trying to achieve much more efficiency, effectiveness, performance, looking for the metrics, right? And if you look at hierarchy, for example, it's much more multi-divisional, decentralized, allows top managers to concentrate on strategy. Also, R&D would be an essential part of the global operating model. It has kind of more, it's geared more towards stability and reduction of uncertainty. So multinational enterprises from developed countries don't like that much risk-taking. And you might think of, but isn't it the same for emerging multinational companies? Because they are also companies, it seems there is a huge value, of course, in terms of trying to achieve efficiency, effectiveness, looking towards your organizational structure, and so on. Well, of course they do, but what we can observe and we can say is that if the operating model of developed multinational enterprises is more geared towards complexity reduction, what you can see is that emerging multinational enterprises differ because their operating model is more geared towards complexity absorption, which makes it quite appropriate for conducting business in other emerging markets. And also, if you look at the operating models, if on one side the DMNEs, the developed multinational enterprises, focus on the hard operating models, emerging multinational enterprises, they tend to focus more on the soft operating models, such as leadership and people, right? So it's very much personalized leadership with very hands-on CEO. So you don't have that much decentralization. So you have much more concentration on power. They tend to be privately or also state-owned. So you have much greater unity in terms of ownership and control. if you look at the leadership style, you will notice that it's much more entrepreneurial leadership we can observe in emerging multinational enterprises. So kind of the risk tolerance, it's much higher in these companies than in developed multinational enterprises. And from a strategic point of view, why I'm trying to understand these nuances in terms of operations and leadership matters is because you need to, when you remember the first slide that I show you, the second slide that I show you, when we're with the different strategies, well, knowing that if you're in entrepreneurial emerging market enterprises going to a developed country context, or you have just acquired a company there, and knowing that people are kind of used to more explicit control processes, they like to have much more kind of decentralized hierarchy. This might create some kind of clashes. So you need to know and plan for how these differences might come in the long term. And this is just a nice quote from Giroud and Bellin and Thomas, saying that developed multinational enterprises are working to improve their networking skills by relying on more local managers rather than expatriates to facilitate the relationships with local authorities and other local companies. Yet their efforts remain inconclusive because they are rigidly standardized, structured, and processes hamper the required emphasis on people or networking talent. So the observation is that when developed countries' multinational enterprises go abroad, the mistake is that if you are acquiring then a company from there or trying to develop a business, to grow your business there, the focus should be on people and networking talent more than, for example, in on the side of operations, efficiency, performance building, and control systems. So if you look at, if we move to the next slides, we can see that actually the next slide. And next slide. I think we talked already about that. It's a repetition. So why we study enterprise, why we study, or why we should study and try to understand emerging market multinational companies is that there is quite a rise of these multinational enterprise in emerging markets in the last 20 years. And they are becoming more and more important. And now, as we even currently in this COVID, post-COVID, or between COVID times, I would say this is becoming more and more important. We will see them. We saw actually observed that many countries, emerging market countries, in terms of how they mobilize themselves, were much better than, for example, in the European context, and in terms of government and also companies. So we can see in terms of growth that we expect more players, the company players, to come from emerging market countries. And if we look at, and this is kind of, it happened in the 1960s. So we saw a lot of Korean, Japanese companies which were appeared in the 1960s in the Fortune Global 500 list. In 2007, for example, we see from companies from these two countries, and Singapore held 92 spots on the list. And similarly, we can expect that emerging multinational enterprises from countries other than South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan held 49 spots on 2007 list. And examples would be Cemex, for example, quite focusing on more regional industry was turned into a dynamic global one, forcing established cement firm such as Holcim of Switzerland and Haverage of France, and also quite rapidly came and started to compete with these other players. Also, Brazil's Embraer was another real kind of thorn in the side of Canada's Bombardier, which was an ex-global market leader in the kind of regional jets. Huawei, another aggressive internationalization strategy that they adopted in order to compete with Alcatel, Siemens, and Ericsson, and also many Indian IT firms. So TCS, Infosys, Wipro, they came and faced giants such as IBM, Accenture. So we see some examples of these trends, and we expect to see many more. And there's a huge, I'll just go quickly through this to the next slide and the one after. So if you can go to the next slide, there's a huge kind of question. And if we look at the literature, there's on one side argument that there are emerging market multinational companies. They have quite a lot of country-specific advantages, and many people argue that basically they're in this kind of virtuous position or access because they have this country-specific advantages. For example, this means a pool of low-cost labor, such as China and India, country with kind of natural resources, Russia, South Africa, and Brazil, large home market, China and India, proximity and privileged access to US market, like Mexico, for example. So their success has been largely viewed as kind of a legacy of their birth, mainly because of country-specific advantages. And we have some of these arguments have been justified by a number of examples. For example, Huawei, being second largest supplier of telecom equipment, has over 140 countries operations, 140 countries. It has 23 R&D worldwide in France, Germany, India, Sweden, UK. Vale also has mining operations in Bahrain, Belgium, Canada, so has 150 minerals and also R&D in 21 countries. And the thing is that cross-border M&As or mergers and acquisitions would not be economically rational for nor profitable actually for shareholders if emerging multinational enterprises were relying solely on home country advantages, which are available also to their competitors, if you think about it, who might be also developed countries multinational if they have internationalized in these markets. And so actually, if you look at, if you go to the next slide, and if we look at and think more about emerging multinational enterprises, we would see that they don't only have, and they're not like just born because they have country-specific advantages, but they also have firm-specific advantages. And there is a good, or also intangible assets, or as well as tangible, but also intangible assets such as capacity to create, process, apply knowledge. They have also powerful brands. They have good managerial capabilities. And there are various examples. I'll just mention a few of those examples which demonstrate this firm-specific advantages. Some of those advantages are based on product, which are suitable for emerging markets, ability to adapt, for example, imported technology to develop the products to the special needs of the local customers, or try understanding the importance of local responsiveness. Also, production and operation excellence. So we can see that there's capabilities for producing efficiently, and also achieving process excellence. So this means good at being able to optimize production processes by using more labor and less capital. Examples here, Tata Steel, for example, from India, has the two of the world's lowest cost producers, and Hindalco, which produces aluminium. Privileged access to resources and markets, meaning that there is a good support in those markets from home government in the form of preferred access to markets, preferential regulation and access to capital. For example, in Brazil, now we have private Embraer, Vale, SNC, Siemens, SN. Advertising advantage is another demonstration for this firm's specific advantages, as well as traditional intangible assets. In showing some cutting edge technology and strong brands like Embraer, Foxconn in Taiwan, Apple, which has a number of developed countries clients such as Apple, Dell, Sony, Nintendo, Samsung. So they all are using the value chain. They're all part of the value chain of Foxconn. So if we go to the next slide, this is just another example of next slide, please. Of an emerging market multinational company. And this is just a small demonstration of some of those country-specific and firm-specific advantages in the case of Turkish Airlines, for example. If you were to do a strategic analysis of Turkish Airlines, for example, you find out there is a number of reasons for their competitiveness. One is the great location, Turkey, Istanbul being a hub connecting Asia with the European market, low cost, high productivity labor. You have a top-down emphasis on service quality, which is supported by investment in people and processes, growing portfolio in partnerships, subsidiaries in order to support both the cost and the revenue side, also strong financial standing and also being supported financially, good position. And if you look at from which of these, for example, are more, we can argue there are more country-specific advantages. This would be definitely the fact that there is a pool of low-cost laborers in their home base, country vast natural resources, the large home market within the country, and also the proximity and privileged access to other vast markets around, right? European market, being able to deliver services in Far East, for example, and firm-specific advantages, product services which are suitable for the emerging markets, so being able to provide high service at low cost, production operational excellence, also the fact that they are going to certain towns, they have certain links which other companies don't have, adversity advantage, privileged access to resources and markets, and also a number of intangible assets which are just traditional, basically, but technology and brand being the most important ones. And the next slide is just a little bit busy slide. If you go to the next slide, it's just a summary of some of these, what it means for the generic strategies of emerging multinational companies and whether we see some differences. And when we position on one side, we see the country-specific advantages. On the other side, we see the firm-specific advantages. And can we provide some examples? For example, in terms of natural resources, and also large home and demand natural resources, and also firm advantages such as privileged access to natural resources. And home countries, we see some, for example, some of the oil and gas companies in Russia, Gazprom, Lukoil, also Norilsk, Vale, AngloGold, PTT, Petrobras, so many of the oil and gas companies, where you see this combination between natural resources in the home country and also you have a privileged access to those natural resources as a company. And we'll see that what it means for the general generic strategy of the company. We see that we have much more natural resource vertical integrator. And if we look at some other kind of on the other side, on the low cost, for example, those companies which are following more of kind of low cost strategy, we see that in terms of country-specific advantages, these would have much more low-cost labor. Size of the skilled labor would be larger. In the same time, we see ability, project management, quite great, process excellence, ability to operate successfully in the adverse conditions of emerging markets. So these are some of the high-tech companies here as an example. Large and rapidly growing home markets, price-sensitive customers, also production and projects execution excellence, late mover advantages, strong position in the home country markets. So in this, if you have both these country-specific advantages and the firm-specific advantages, here we see that mainly generic strategies of some emerging multinational companies are more kind of global consolidator type or global strategy, if you think of the second slide that I showed you earlier. And okay, so I think if we go to the next slide, I think that was everything. So I'll just stop here because I'm a bit conscious of the time. Yes, do you have any questions?
Hi, Doctora.
Hi, Anthony.
We thank you for this such an excellent presentation. We have some questions from the audience, and the first one is a country that is considered as an emerging market can change their status in front the economic system?
Of course, in terms of becoming a developed country, you mean from the, can you repeat the question? Because I don't see the questions actually written.
Okay, I repeat it. When
from a country point of view, or from a, yes, from a country point of view, of course, we can see, and we have seen such trends. For example, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Singapore, so some of those developed economies now, they have gone through being an emerging market economist, and they have grown. So we can see that this transition, of course, it takes time, and it's not only, and it's also should be driven by government and also politics, because in the same time we see a lot of emerging market multinationals which are coming from countries, for example, South Africa or other countries which are, in terms of politics, there are quite a lot of still some issues, or more weaker institutions if we compare them to developed countries and their multinationals.
Okay, next move to the next question. Which details are important to change this status? Because as we know, an emerging market is a country that needs the big things about the big countries. So how can, or which details are important to change this status?
Well, so some of these emerging markets, multinational companies, they are, and what is kind of different from other developed countries, multinationals, is the fact that the way they are able to take advantage of local knowledge, but also knowledge which is provided to them by other developed countries, multinationals, which are already in the context. So if you look at, for example, Chinese companies, and many of these Chinese companies, before they grow and they become multinationals, they were local companies trying to compete or learn from international companies which are in the Chinese market, and then trying to outperform them by, and this is of course quite easy in the local market, especially if you are, you know, the culture, the preferences. Of course, it's much harder for emerging multinational companies to go to developed countries, but we see this trend. So we see that the move from emerging multinationals have been to go to other less developed countries and try to grow their market, but some of course also for resource purposes as well.
Perfect. And the next one, exists some advantage to be an emerging market in order to, as you know, a country considered as emerging market is considered for the international community as poor country. I don't want to say poor, but as you know, an emerging market could be considered like that. So exists some advantage for this emerging country to be considered in that way.
From a company point of view, of course, I mean, if you look at the slides that we talked about, what are the main differences between developed countries in developed markets in emerging markets? Well, some of these advantages that are, of course, cheap labor, not necessarily skilled, but cheaper labor. And this has been the reason why many developed countries, multinationals, have decided first place to go to these markets, to emerging markets context. This is one of the kind of main, more in terms of kind of economical positioning, main difference between these two contexts. But it has been a significant push in terms of emerging developed countries, multinational going to emerging markets. For emerging markets, we can see that, of course, policy, for example, in China, Chinese government has been quite supportive to many of these companies. So this policy and government is a factor, but it is not in all contexts. That's the main factor.
Okay, the final question. We know that the policy, the politics in a country are important in order to change the point of view of the economy, but how the enterprises can change the country situation to improve their position in front of the economy system?
Well, this is a huge question. That's a very good question, but the question actually comes and pushes us to think here about the responsibility. Is it the responsibility? And this question that's not only for emerging markets, but also for developed countries and their companies. Is it the responsibility of the enterprises, of the companies to, for example, take care of their stakeholders, of communities, or is it the government? Or is it both in terms of partnership? In cases where companies in general, here I'm talking, are internationalizing or going to places with kind of weak institutions, one would expect that they need to drive this change, and there's a lot of debate in terms of what is the responsibility of companies. Are they responsible for driving change and, for example, improving local communities? An economical system or not, or is the government? So it's a huge debate on this topic.
Yeah, I understand. So we thank you, Dr. Stoyanova, for this excellent presentation, such an excellent presentation, and for your special participation, and also all attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. Also, we invite you to continue supporting the education of talent students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donation button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa events. Thank you, Dr. Stoyanova. We know that the virtual situation maybe can do the things more difficult, but we appreciate your presentation.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you so much to your team for the invitation and for the time to our audience. I wish everyone a wonderful day and a nice weekend tomorrow. So, and yeah, keep in touch.
Thank you, Dr. Esteban.
Thank you.